Okay, so if everybody had breakfast, coffee, and nice sleep, and you still want to hear something about utopias, then I would like to resume yesterday's very nice discussions and lectures. And Eglantina Remport is the first one to give a talk about Irish context and how it relates to democracy and utopia. So you're welcome to come. And then we will have the same, as I was told by Zsolt, the same ritual that we will have the 4 papers and then the discussion.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. Can you all hear me okay there? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you to Zsolt and Nima for organizing this conference. It's been great, and I hope you can see that this paper connects to many of the papers that we listened to yesterday, from Mirchel's to Gregory Claes's ideas and some of the things that you mentioned. So I'm going to talk to you about this work, which is the Proclamation of the Irish Republic. Dates back to 1916. It's a short document. It had 7 signatories, and as you can see, the address it was written by the provisional government of the Irish Republic to the people of Ireland. And as I said, this is a short document. I'm going to refer to some parts of it. The Proclamation of the Irish Republic is an iconic text from Ireland's revolutionary period between 1916 and 1923. This period is celebrated in Ireland under the auspices of the government-funded scheme Decades of Centenaries and Century Ireland, a commemorative scheme created by RTE, Radio Telefís Éireann, which is Ireland National Television and Radio Broadcaster, and Boston College, one of the most impressive Irish studies centers in the United States of America. You can see their wee logo on the site of Century Ireland. In what follows, I'm going to offer a reading of the Proclamation as a utopian text, referencing some of Miguel Abençour's ideas outlined in his 1997 article, Utopia and Democracy. Since I am an Irish studies scholar rather than a utopian studies scholar, my approach will be historical rather than theoretical, although at some point the 2 approaches will inevitably be intertwined. The proclamation was written for the occasion of the Easter Rising of 1916 and was read out on Easter Monday, the first day of the rebellion, outside the General Post Office in Dublin, and approximately 2,500 copies were distributed, informing the city's citizens of the political changes that would take place in Ireland. And there you can see a picture of the GPO in all its glory today. Now on O'Connell Street, what used to be Sackville Street. And in the top right corner, you can see the flag of the Irish Republic, all in green, one of those original copies. The proclamation declared Ireland a republic, politically free and independent of the British Crown. For over a century, Ireland had been a constituent part of the United Kingdom, created by the Acts of Union of 1800. The proclamation read, that we declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland, to the unfettered control of Irish destinies, to be sovereign and indefeasible. In the later part, it says, we hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state, and we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, unquote. Following an introductory passage identifying these comrades in arms as members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Irish Volunteers, and the Irish Citizen Army, the proclamation described the revolutionaries' vision of this new Ireland. As integral part of this vision, the proclamation made declarations about democratic representation, universal suffrage, and the treatment of religious minorities in this new republic. And here's a longer passage from it, which goes, quote, the Irish Republic is entitled to and hereby claims the allegiance of every Irishman and Irish woman. It's something important I like to come back to. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and all of its parts, cherishing all of the children of the nation equally, and oblivious of the differences, carefully fostered by an alien government which have divided the minority from the majority in the past, unquote. Some part of this statement is somewhat bold and idealistic, especially in assuming that all children of the nation desire to the one nation, given the fact that over 230,000 men and 230,000 women of Ulster Protestant background had signed what is called the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant and Declaration. The men signed the covenant and the women signed the declaration on the 28th of September in 1912, declaring their allegiance to, quote, His Gracious Majesty, King George V, unquote, and also, quote, the unity of the British Empire. So this is a Protestant document that predates the proclamation by 4 years. Authorship of the proclamation is unknown, but one of the signatories of the document is Commander-in-Chief of the Easter Rising, Patrick Pearse. His headquarters was in the GPO. Pearse was a lawyer by profession who had written a number of pamphlets in the month leading up to the Rising. One of them is entitled The Sovereign People, and there are other two, The Separatist Idea and The Spiritual Nation. I'll be referring to these texts later on. So all of these were written or drafted just 2-3 months before the rebellion in 1916. Pearse stated in this pamphlet, that is The Sovereign People, what he called a democratic truth that were to, quote, pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation. And I think that kind of chimes with one of the papers yesterday about the happiness of the person or happiness of the individual, happiness of the nation. I'm going to quote 5 passages from The Sovereign People, each of them describing his democratic truth. So the first one is about the members of the nation. Physically consider the nation consists of its men and women, and of all of its men and women, without any exception. Every man and every woman within the nation has normally equal rights, but a man or a woman may forfeit his or her rights by turning recreant to the nation. The second one is about class division. What he says is this: no class in the nation is entitled to privileges beyond any other class except with the consent of the nation. The right and privilege to make laws or to administer laws does not reside in any class within the nation. It resides in the whole nation, that is, in the whole people, and can be lawfully exercised only by those to whom it is delegated by the whole people. You can tell that he's a lawyer, he's using all that language. About making laws, he has the following to say: the people, if wise, will choose as the makers and administrators of their laws men and women actually and fully representative of all the men and women of the nation. The men and women of no property equally with the men and women of property. Again, I think it chimes very nicely with what Myrtle was talking about yesterday. About the rights of the individual and that of the collective rights, again, there is this passage, and there'll be one more left only. So he says, once more, no individual right is good as against the right of the whole people, but the people, in exercising its sovereign rights, is morally bound to consider individual rights to do equity between itself and each of the individuals that compose it, as well as to see the equity is done between individual and individual. And lastly, about property ownership, he says, a nation may go further and determine that all sources of wealth whatsoever are the property of the nation, that each individual shall give his service for the nation's good and shall be adequately provided for by the nation, and that all surplus wealth shall go to the national treasury to be expended on national purposes rather than be accumulated by private persons. Now, in Utopia and Democracy, Abensour situated his ideas within the framework of a French school of philosophical thought, with references to Charles Fourier, Herbert Marcuse, André Breton, Pierre Laroux, Claude Lefort, and Emmanuel Levinas. In The Sovereign People, Patrick Pearse formulated his theory of democratic truth within a specifically Irish theoretical and political tradition, drawing on the writings of Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet, Thomas Davis, James Fintan Lalore, and John Mitchell. He discussed the ideas of these Irishmen in two essays drafted just months before the Easter Rising. I've mentioned these: The Separatist Idea, dating the 1st of February, and The Spiritual Nation, dating the 13th of February. Within this Irish tradition of political thought, the future of a democratic Irish republic was not at variance with an idealist vision of a utopian society that was based on both the freedom of the individual and the collective, quote, happiness and prosperity of the nation. And this is again a quotation from The Separatist Idea. These interlinked ideas are emphasized in the Proclamation, using Pearse's exact wording from The Sovereign People and The Separatist Idea. As mentioned, authorship of the Proclamation has been a matter of debate. So there's a lot of debate over who has written the Proclamation, although the text does seem to be infused with Pearse's nationalist sentiments and include verbatim quotations from his last pamphlets from February and March 1916. For Pearse, as for Tone and Davis before him, individual freedom and the freedom of the nation as a whole were interconnected, one supporting the other in all matters of Irish life, that is legislation, taxation, property ownership, etc. He derives his ideas from the writings of all these people, that is Wolfe Tone, Daniel O'Connell, and Thomas Davis, and these are all important characters in Irish history. They're all connected to either the United Irishmen Rebellion, the Repeal Movement, or the Young Ireland Movement, and they're all theoreticians as well. So they wrote about democracy and its connection to individual rights and the rights of the people, rights of the nation. They love using the word nation for historical reasons. I'm also going to refer to later to the Irish National Land League of the 1880s. This line of thought has been developed during centuries of what is called usurpation of Ireland. Again, this is a word from the Proclamation, whereby land originally owned by Catholics was forcefully confiscated by newly arriving Protestant landlords from Britain, armed and loyal to the British monarch. This is a reference to the Tudor plantations. Of course, plantations started before the Tudor period, but I'm going to just start there. Also, the Catholic majority of the island's population were banned from holding office in Ireland and were denied the rights of education and political representation, especially during the 18th century under the penal laws. And during the 19th century, Irish Catholics were anglicized through these British government schemes, such as the National School System, the Ordnance Survey, or religious movement or decisions such as establishing the Protestant Church as the established Church of Ireland, and the Second Reformation of the 1920s, which was this proselytizing period in Ireland. So as Daniel O'Connell and the Repeal Association of the 1830s were calling for the repeal or the termination of the Act of Union, a case was made for Ireland to become a republic, independent of the British Crown. Such calls raised concerns in British political circles, and cartoons caricatured Ireland as a land where democracy would inevitably lead to anarchy, should Ireland be granted freedom from the British Crown. And I show you two cartoons. Those who are in Irish studies are very well familiar with these, but I thought I'm going to show these to you. These two cartoons are from the Punch magazine from 1880, one from 1881, and then the other one is from 1883. On the one, you can see Britannia on the left. You can see Britannia dressed as Pallas Athena, referring back to this to the Greeks, who is protecting Hibernia, that figure of the kind of the smaller, younger woman, from an ape-like figure of Irish anarchy. So you have this simian figure of Irish anarchy brought about by the Land League. So basically claiming that Britannia is going to protect Ireland from the anarchy that would be caused by the Land League. So if any democratic movement gained force in Ireland. And the other one, you have the simian Caliban-like figure of the Irish National Land League that is seated on this barrel of anarchy, rebellion, and murder, again referring to the Land League. if you want to read more about this, you can. There is a book on this by L.P. Curtis. So such calls rang alarm bells in Ireland as well, especially among those in leadership positions or directly connected with the British establishment in Ireland. Among nationalist circles, however, there developed an idea that Ireland as a sovereign nation should manage its own affairs, as discussed in an article printed in The Nation on the 29th of April in 1848. And I just quote one sentence from it, because I think it's quite pertinent. The Nation article written during this revolutionary month of April 1848 declared that democracy is the destiny of the world. So let's move forward. But just the question is there, what kind of democracy? That's again a question in Ireland as well as in Britain and anywhere else. By the time Pearse began disseminating his ideas of democratic truth in the separatist idea and some of it in the Proclamation, he had incorporated some of the ideas of his comrade in arms, James Connolly, that's him on the right, who was leader of the Irish Citizen Army. Connolly fought alongside Pearse at the GPO in Dublin during the Easter Rising of April 1916 and was consequently executed by a firing squad in Kilmainham Jail in Dublin on the 12th of May in 1916. Connolly was born in Scotland of Irish parents, and you need to remember that he was a socialist, he was a Marxist who contributed pieces to the newspaper The Irish Worker. And there's a critic, Conor McCarthy, who reminds us that in 1915, and this is a quote, Connolly published a series of articles on insurrection and urban warfare in earlier revolutionary situations. He made reference to Paris in 1830, Belgium in 1830 again, Paris 1848, and then Moscow in 1905, unquote. Connolly advocated the notion of a socialist republic. Sometimes he switches with socialist democracy, socialist republic, so the two kind of means the same for him in his writing, in which quote, all political and social positions, there's the quote, so in this republic, all political and social positions should be open to all men and women, that all privileges of birth or wealth be abolished, and that every man or woman born into this land should have an equal opportunity to attain to the proudest position of Ireland, of the land, that is to be the president of the country or president of the republic. Connolly's core calls for gender equality before the law in terms of suffrage, general legislation, and property ownership echoed in the words of the Proclamation, situating the cause of Irish democracy in the 20th century. As you can see, the Proclamation reads, the first is a quote we had looked at, that the Republic will guarantee religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens, and that it declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation, and that it will cherish all the nations all the children of the nation equally. And there's also a sentence or half a sentence later on, which says that the national government, when it will be elected, will be the representative of the whole people of Ireland and elected by the suffrages of all her men and women. Again, this is a thought that Pearse borrows from Connolly's socialist ideas. So the Proclamation was written in a style that was characteristic of Pearse's revolutionary writings and was infused with a passionate Catholicism of 19th century Irish nationalism. See, for instance, the opening scene, and we're getting to the end of this wee talk. This is how it starts. This is the call to Irish men and women. So it says, Irish men and women, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. This is one of the most quoted passages. As I said, that's the first sentence of the Proclamation. And when you start reading the Proclamation, you feel like this is a very traditional text. You know, it upholds all these traditional Christian values of Catholic Ireland of the 19th, 18th, and 17th centuries. But when you read on and you see the incorporation of James Connolly's ideas, you also recognize that, you know, it's actually quite a progressive text. And it has many modern ideas of equality, gender, relating to gender, suffrage, and all that. So I would suggest that we should read this instead of as a really kind of nationalist text, but as a text that is forward-looking, that is progressive, and that incorporated the latest of socialist and feminist thought to be applied to this free and independent Irish Republic that they wanted to create. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. And then now we are moving east, I think, from the Eastern Uprising, and that Bozóki will talk about ideas between innovation and imitation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to pick Zsolt Cigányik's observations about Imre Madács and the tragedy of man that was discussed yesterday, when there are different schemes back to the history, to Egypt and Athens and Rome, Prague, Paris and London. So I was thinking that maybe it is not accidental that a Central European author observed history like this, because these are certain historical steps, historical paradigms, and that can be observed by someone who is outside these paradigms, like Central Europe or East Central Europe was outside of these major global or continental paradigms. So it is a position to relativize it or to create a relationship to these externally set conditions which can be easily ideologized or utopianized. And I think ideology and utopia are separated strongly by Karl Mannheim. By the way, he was born in Budapest, a famous sociologist of knowledge. But what I try to argue today, that it is not so much separated in the Central European thought. Both progressive and not so progressive thinkers sometimes spoke about ideologies those were utopian visions. So sometimes ideologies had strongly utopian tones, because those were not really corresponding to the reality. So that is one thing. I think the other one is the issue of imitation and innovation. Is it true that Central European countries only imitated these paradigms and utopias, or they used it in an innovative way or tried to hybridize them or so? So here is the motivation of my talk was given by, I am a political scientist or political sociologist. So Leslie Holmes and Ivan Krastev wrote their book, A Line That Failed. And they said that the major reason why populism was so successful in the last decade was because liberalism was canonized, and liberalism was seen as an imitation. So current populism, illiberalism, represents a counter-revolution against liberalism. Why? Because the diversity within liberalism was forgotten after '89. Liberalism left its own pluralism behind, and it presented itself as a new hegemony. So if it has such a canonical status, and plus the politics of imitation of the West, they argue, then it is no surprise that people turn to populism, which is not so alienated. So it seems like hegemonic liberalism is presented as utopianism. And I thought that such an interesting thing, that at one moment liberalism is a very successful mobilizing ideology, let's say the 1980s, and after 10 years, it is dominating and hegemonic and more alienated from the real life, and people tend to see it as a utopia. So is it possible that liberalism can be ideology and utopia at the same time? Two Polish authors, Karolina Wigura and Jaroslav Kuisz, argued that rationalism was the problem, that liberalism was purely rationalist, and what politics needs is also passions and emotions. And therefore, liberalism was more individual, demands trust in people, which contradicts to the historical experience of East Central Europe. And we have to remember that the greatest successes of liberal democracies emerged from hope. So somehow trying to bring back the positive connotations of liberalism, what we can call the passionate liberalism. That is one possible answer to this problem of imitation. They say the problem was not the imitation, but the problem was the lack of passion. And another author writing at the same time about other things, Timothy Snyder, a very pessimistic book about the loss of liberty. He distinguished between two types of politics, the politics of inevitability and the politics of eternity. And he defines that liberals behave like progress is inevitable. So whatever happens, the history goes on its own way. All politics and policies should be derived from this belief that there is an inevitable channel in which history moves forward. And that was his critique. There is actually another type of politics that conservatives like more, and that is the politics of eternity. That is circulation. It is not linear progress, but circulation. And it seems like there is an eternal circularity, and the two approaches contradict to each other. And maybe we can also think about that there are utopias of inevitability, about how future society should look like, or utopias of eternity, immovable, non-changing, fixed, frozen characteristics. And then, of course, there are some innovations, and I would suggest the concept of third way utopianism, that is trying to find some space between irreconcilable models, and also skepticism. I find it quite typical when even on the men of the streets often say that is utopia because it doesn't fit what we can experience here. So there is a very skeptical attitude to ideologies if they do not fit of reality. And all of these utopias that I try to investigate, the common denominator was humanism, to find how to humanize society, and utopia was presented as a humane entity to make it more attractive for ordinary people. But also the other one appeared that negative utopia, which dehumanized people, and we have not to follow that, like capitalism, for instance. So I don't want to read what is written there. The point here is that one third way utopianism was the anarchist movement, late 19th century, early 28th century in Hungary. They had a major problem that the East Central Europe was living between the attraction of democracy and anarchism, pure anarchism, for them, the thinkers. And they tried to, democracy was close enough to reach, but actually we never reached it. So it was an ambivalent relationship to democracy. So they tried to make a middle road between democracy and anarchism. Therefore, I call them anarcho-democrats. Just a few examples. These guys, particularly Jenő Henrik Schmidt, a philosopher from the late 19th, early 20th century, he believed in a non-violent anarchist society. It was really a non-violent society of non-violence, really with a utopian character, but he did not elaborate fully. He was strongly against the church, and against the radical violent anarchists. And he believed that society can be built on purely non-violence. This is what he called ideal anarchism. And another guy tried to find a third way between socialism and anarchism, combining these two elements. He rejected democracy as an anarchist, Count Ervin Batthyány. He was influenced by William Morris, Free Socialism, and the communist anarchism by Kropotkin. So he rejected both social democracy and violent anarchism. And that is his definition of anarchism and his anarchist vision of the society. By anarchism, freedom from rule, we must understand the social order based purely upon the free, fraternal cooperation of the people with no external power or violence. And all other systems are based on violence, therefore, those must be rejected. And here is what he thinks about democracy, a rejection of democracy on anarchist grounds. Democracy is the last, best disguised, and thus the strongest bastion of the present ruling system. And he rejects the possibility that we can move towards democracy. And he says, I consider it to be deeply mistaken and dangerous. It doesn't go to the ideal society. Democracy is a wrong compromise here. And what he rather offers, a fusion of socialism and anarchism, when he realized that pure anarchism doesn't work in Hungary, and that he believed that socialist movements will help out the crisis of anarchism. And he says, socialism without anarchism, hopeless slavery, the divine right of officialdom to rule. Anarchism without socialism is also inconceivable. So there is nothing wrong substantively with anarchism, but the problem is it is inconceivable. But there are substantive problems with socialism, but if you have a fusion with anarchism, it will be all right. So socialism is not just a precondition of anarchism, rather anarchism actually embraces socialism in itself, within itself. Again, another thinker believed that social democracy should be rejected and pure anarchism as well. And here is an imitation in some ways, the French anarcho-syndicalist thinking. He was not a utopian, he was an ideologue in a Gramscian sense, Erwin Szabó, but also a serious thinker and the founder of public libraries. So he was influenced by the French anarchists and socialists and believed that anarcho-syndicalism would be this hybrid mixed model which can work for liberation. Just like another Hungarian guy, Oskar Jászai, he again tried to fuse two different models, socialism and liberalism. He refused laissez-faire liberalism and also state socialism, which existed already, rejecting communism. And he proposed a sort of democracy which is more anarchistic, and he is proud of that. It is not wrong nothing wrong in that. And again, liberal socialism, we can ask the question, is it an ideology or utopia? It never fulfilled. It looks like a beautiful combination of the best of two different ideologies. Actually, that is quite characteristic in this part of Europe to mix two ideologies and take the best out of it and forget those which are not so beautiful. Liberal socialism does not merely flirt with democracy, but rather takes it to its limit. I'm sorry. So please read this last two paragraphs. He says we must create a new ideology of this socialism, but it sounds like a utopia. So I am not saying, I mean, utopia is a fixed thing, moral vision, comprehensive. This is not comprehensive, so it is really ideology and not utopia. But if you read it, it sounds like a very strongly utopian influenced ideology. And we have another thinker who also believed that you can combine non-exploitation with equality. So the Western techniques of liberation and liberty, Western techniques of freedom combined with with equality, non-exploitation. So he believes that Western liberalism is not just about capitalism, not just about exploitation, relationship between labor and capital. You can take the best of it without hurting its logic. So power should be divided into small pieces, and therefore no one will have enough power to oppress others. And if the power is divided to really little pieces, then at the end there will be no power belonging to anyone, so it will be more like an anarchy. So refusal of capitalism and state socialism, a bit of Eurocentrism, because this is the meaning of the European social evolution, and again, too beautiful to be true, right? And we have another thinker, very different in many respects, the Czech Václav Havel, and his concept that post-totalitarianism is basically about anonymity, monotony, conformity, and discipline, a gray ritual field, basically an existential dystopia. And people try to survive by paying tribute to ritually, not lying directly, but living in a system of lie. And Havel is refusing to call the dissidents as opposition because he doesn't like these structured entities like government and opposition. He likes to focus on individuals and autonomy and bottom-up solidarity. So he's in many ways an existentialist, and he believed that living within the truth can be an existential choice. So in a post-totalitarian regime, demoralized people are living in this real existing dystopia. Individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. You don't have to do anything special. You are part of the system. And therefore, this is a ritual communication within the system of power. and anonymous, automatized, dehumanized structure. So sounds pretty dystopian, this description of post-totalitarianism. And the solution is pretty easy, so to say. The individual should step out from this. This is an individual choice. So like going out from darkness to the light. And who steps out of line denies in its principle and threatens in its entirety. So living in truth means an individual choice, an existential revolution. But Havel goes a step beyond and says that post-totalitarianism is just part of the global technological civilization, and therefore it is not just the issue of communism. It is a consumer society, global technological structures, and he doesn't like that. He wants to go beyond the systems and focusing on individual people. Instead of regime change or systemic change, he wants existential revolution to post-democracy. That is very interesting if we consider the topic of this conference, Utopia and democracy. He wants to, jump out of post-totalitarianism, but not to democracy, but to post-democracy. And it is like the light at the end of the tunnel. So an individual existential revolution leading to post-democracy. It is not explained what post-democracy is, but it has a strongly sort of liberation, salvation, a utopian character. That is my feeling. I am not a utopia scholar. I am a comparative political scientist. And finally, the last guy I want to mention is Gáspár Miklós Tamás, Hungarian philosopher, recently died, unfortunately. He, in a manifesto, he claimed that capitalism is a utopia. We are falsely recognizing the word when we describe it as capitalism. It is not. And capitalism is a dehumanized utopia. Free market and free competition are utopias. And universal market exchange is also a utopia. So it's try to present freedom as an opposite to utopia. If you want to liberate yourself, you have to get rid of the idea of capitalism, because that is utopia, and utopia is rigid and inhuman. And that is his idea. The universal brotherhood is not utopian, quite the contrary. Those who support capitalism, those are utopians. And those thoughts are called utopia. He gives a definition here, which are unrelated to everyday experience and aim to achieve their goals mostly with abstract moral purpose. So it is a sort of unfavorable presentation of utopia. It's not about happiness or, salvation or something, but it is something which against human nature. And here he gives a long description about how capitalism developed. We believe that it was like free market and something, but it was a major oppression, brutality, degeneration, colonialist genocides, death camps, etc., world wars, and this is how capitalism developed. So interesting that he used the notion of utopia to capitalism. Maybe we should think about it further. And as he says, capitalism is a utopia in the sense as its supporters present it in opposition to evident experience and common sense. So utopia is contrasted with common sense and human nature. Capitalism in Central Europe is an imitation of a utopia, oppressive system, and he refers to Karl Polanyi, when he criticized that sort of uncritical approval of capitalism. So to wrap up, there are some approaches which most of them are supporting humane society, responsibility, freedom, moral liberation, dignity, trust-based communities, solidarity networks, cooperatives. So some sort of individual responsibility together with bottom-up solidarity networks and against large structures. So it's like, and maybe another Central European characteristic, small is beautiful, let's cultivate our gardens, let's build houses. So against the large structures, against the system, against capitalism, state socialism, post-totalitarianism, consumer society, Tsarist absolutism, representative democracy, and the like. So I think there is more innovation here than imitation, but the innovation always occurs within this external framework shaped by the imitation. Thank you very much.
So much, and then now we are continuing the East Central European travel with Ondrej Slacalek's paper about the end of a new beginning of anti-utopian democracy.
So, hello, thank you very much to organizers for inviting me for this conference. I actually share with András Bozóki interest in Central and Eastern European anarchism and radical democracy, but now I will speak about completely different topic, and it will be more like essay in original meaning of the word, like attempt. And this attempt will be based on correspondence between thinking about literary genres and about forms of democracy. I start with a few questions, actually. The first is, how does various concepts of democracy, and I don't mean concepts in political, theoretical meaning, but more like zeitgeist, so something what you cannot touch, but it's everywhere. And how they correspond with literary genres, utopia, anti-utopia, and dystopia. I deliberately write it in bad orthography, that dystopia, to underline that original connection of something bad spoiled. How can we understand various versions of democracy from the point of view of formal or procedural versus content utopias? And what is relationship between utopia, democracy, and truth? And also, to some extent, progress. And the last question is some common denominator of all three, and it's where we are now. And I start with operational definitions. You know that operational definitions are not proper definition. They don't work and don't eliminate key characteristics, but they should tell us if the thing is present here. So my operational definition of utopia is overcoming human condition, whatever it means. In my view, it can be existing human condition, something what is falsely conceived being human condition, but it's not. But also it can be more radical and titanic, and there can be present idea, okay, we will be like gods. Anti-utopia is based on determining fear of attempts of overcoming human condition. And dystopia is characterized by determining fear of future, which is coming. And then I will speak about three forms of democracy. The first I would call utopian democracy, and it's democracy connected with emancipatory project of enlightenment. It's democracy connected with ideas of democratic revolution, and I think what we heard about, for example, Irish democratic movement is one of many possible illustrations. I will try to some other, but mostly I want to underline that this kind of democracy is connected with vision of possible human perfection by education. Yeah, you can be educated. The democracy is part of Enlightenment project of emancipation based in education and progress. And this is exactly the answer which is posited by followers of this version of democracy to strong anti-democratic critique, which was present mostly in conservative circles, but not only there, and which can be summarized in word crowd, and Le Bon's or others' interpretation of it, like, okay, you have here those uneducated masses, and you want to give them power. It will not work simply. Exactly, and in anarchy and in worst case scenarios which we can imagine. So, argument against this strong anti-democratic argumentation is possibility of human perfection by education. And in this context, we should understand democracy as something like formal, procedural part of some broader content utopia of human perfection by education, by progress of science and humanity. I tried to, and it's very disputable if this concept of democracy can be really called utopia, because of course we connect utopia with more radical transcending of human condition. And when I quote Masaryk's Declaration of Independence of the Czech nation, we believe in liberty and liberty evermore. It's something what sounds really strange, progressivist, but maybe not utopian in a more strict sense. But I believe that even this moderate utopianism is still utopianism. And maybe I will demonstrate it on one quotation of such a critical and skeptical author like István Bibor, who speaks about democracy and his miseries of the East European small states. And he writes as follows: to be a democrat is first and foremost not to be afraid. Not to be afraid of those who have a different opinion, speak a different language, and are of different race. Not to be afraid of revolution, conspiracies, the unknown evil intentions of the enemy, hostile propaganda, disdain, and generally all these imaginary dangers that became real because we are afraid of them. And of course, this quotation can be read in two ways. One is to understand fear as, and let's think about context, Atlantic Charter, freedom from fear, and so on, like fear about something like bad analysis, what is developed in this quotation as something what is not human condition, but what is bad analysis of situation. But I think there is also that connotation of fear, like something what is part of human condition, part of human destiny. And democracy from this point of view has some liberatory, emancipatory, utopian ambition to liberate human beings from fear. Let's skip to anti-utopian democracy, what is something what I think replaced this concept of democracy during Cold War. There is that idea of, because of course facing totalitarianism, it was necessary somehow to correct arrogance, Enlightenment, and in this context we can refer to Popper and other authors, and to think about democracy and set of procedures which can correct arrogance of enlightenment. And in this context, formal aspect of democracy becomes crucial, becomes the most important, and it's problematical to understand democracy as part of some broader content, revolutionary, emancipatory utopia, and instead of it, it's component of some set of procedural formal utopias, together with human rights, together with free market, and so on. There is a question of progress which is important, like there are two approaches which can be to progress, which can be identified in this concept of anti-utopian democracy. According to one, progress was hubris of Enlightenment project. Progress, the idea of progress itself is something deeply problematical, and what can we only do is learn from failures of attempts of progress. Yeah, what can we? This is the only thing we can do. So it's basically anti-progressivist thinking. But from some other point of view, exactly this gesture is progressivist, because as we learn from these attempts, we know more, we progress. We are not as stupid as our dads and grandfathers and moms and grandmothers, and we can move. I will, and now I will skip something, and I will ask what happened after triumph of this anti-utopian democracy after 1989. Did it continue in this schematically reconstructed way? From some point of view, I think we can tell yes. Experience with totalitarianism somehow revived all instincts of liberalism to limit power, to focus on control of power. We are afraid of tyranny. So we need to build some institution of checks and balances, and this important instincts or obsessions which were present in liberalism, democratic imagination of liberalism, considered because of it was born from struggle with absolutism of monarchical power, were revived by struggle against totalitarianism. So from some point of view, this focus on the fear of power and tyrannophobia became important part of this democratic project after 1989, and we can say that, okay, this is continuation of anti-utopian ideas present in this concept of democracy. But on the other hand, there was that reconstruction of democratic enthusiasm, of that idea that democratic revolution can really change the world and spread democracy everywhere, even by force, and it will mean emancipation somehow. And so this recreation of democratic enthusiasm can bring us back to Utopia version of democracy. And I think we lived in 2 decades after end of Cold War, we lived in some combination of utopian and anti-utopian democracy. And ideal body expression of this combination is George W. Bush. He is somebody who embodies triumph of democratic enthusiasm. But and spreading of democracy everywhere, but you can't be really enthusiastic of him, or the fact that really mediocre son of one of former presidents becomes president and spreads, and that the most important superpower empire is led by this guy. I think years came when we remembered him and thought, okay, come back, everything is forgotten. But in that time, I think he really provoked that idea that, okay, we can be enthusiastic of him only for not being something different. I think Czech former dissident and feminist expressed it in citing, paraphrasing well-known quotation about Sartre and Fanon, like it's better to be wrong with George W. Bush than to be right with Putin. So yeah, this is a form of enthusiasm which he provoked. And but I think we remember George W. Bush as part of some different historical moment, because what we live in is something what we could call dystopian democracy. And we should remember that quotation of István Bibó, that the democrat means not being afraid. And who can call himself or herself democrat in this way? Who is not afraid? Now, Trumpists or Urbanists are afraid of liberals. Liberals are afraid of Trumpists. And, we lived a few years ago during refugee crisis in where the majority of our societies were from some point of view, meaningless fear from Muslims, but we who polemicized with them and tried to politically struggle against the racism were afraid of them. We were super afraid of them. And maybe we were afraid of them even more than they were afraid of Muslims. And so there is some omnipresence of fear as characteristics. There is some inverted meaning of progress. We are really afraid of progression of time on the level of psychological and maybe psychiatric diagnosis, climate fear. And so we are really afraid of what is coming. And if we ask about the meaning of truth in this concept of democracy, we have to remember a very popular buzzword of post-truth, which is really interesting both depiction of situation and character, and in fact part of this situation. And what we have seen, we can discuss it in debate, but maybe we can summarize it for the purpose of provocation, that it was some adequate, popular and populist appropriation of postmodern condition, including epistemic instability and deconstruction of political subject. And on the other hand, backlash on the level of liberal intelligentsia, which was challenged by, and its importance was challenged by, I think that using of diagnosis of post-truth was identitarian struggle of liberal intelligentsia, because totemic animal of this tribe was attacked, because totemic animal of this tribe is truth understood as facts. And it's, I think, not very, it's not the only one possibility how to understand truth, at least, to say at least. So it reacted with very self-centered and somehow naive concept of truth. And it brings me to second and last image in my presentation, and to the question, like, what in this context is utopia? And I think what was utopia of this hardcore of demonstrators who entered into Congress building, and I think we know it. Their utopia was truth. They knew truths about crimes of elites, and they hope they will finally find the evidence in some place of power. They failed actually, but they at least believe, and that there is some place where truth is present and can be found and presented. And so what I think happens actually is that we live under condition of something what I would call dystopian democracy. But both sides of this extremely polarized moment are working with tools which are legacies of anti-utopian democracy. Yeah, we can think about anti-liberalism of Trumpists and urbanists, and what is fascinating on this version of anti-liberalism is that it's really modeled according to anti-communism and anti-totalitarianism. Liberalism is reconstructed as a new totalitarian ideology. It's anti-communism 2.0 with many problems which actually it brings about, because not only that even all liberal anti-communism had conservative anti-communism had a lot of cartoon-like images problems, but also it characterized completely different form of ideology. But also there is some return which is maybe even more interesting, because on some level anti-populism of liberal is based on idea that okay, these are new threads which are somehow similar to those totalitarian. We struggled against totalitarian. Snyder is classic version of it. We struggled against communists, and now we have new fascists, and we have to only to read Havel to understand Trump. Okay, so we have only to revive our knowledge from Cold War to understand these new evils. But in fact, there is another important moment, that this anti-populist movement of liberals is not only update of this anti-utopian democratic narrative of the Cold War, but it's also somehow often meets with anti-democratic criticism of utopian democracy, because there is that fear of the people, of uneducated crowd, which lives in post-truth and does not believe to its elites and can be manipulated by big data corporations or by Russian propaganda. So if you have population which can be manipulated by Russian propaganda, does it make sense to have democracy? No. Democracy becomes only weapon for inimical forces. And in war, to notice neither where Putin escorted Trump to White House, doesn't make sense to have democracy. So we come back somehow to the idea of uneducated crowd or masses. And what I think is, I will soon, but what is the last important characteristic of this situation is that both sides are looking for some guarantees. They want to find something solid in this unstable situation. And those guarantees are mostly old, well-known institutions, old formal and procedural utopias like state sovereignty for populists or human rights for liberals. But what I think they play different role from their original. They are not procedural or formal utopias anymore. they are totemic objects which have to symbolize that we still live in some old world. They are guarantees, and they actually should become values. As András quoted Vigora and co-author, like those old liberal institutions which wanted to be passionless had to provoke some passionate identification, but can they still be liberal institution in that context? And I will end here. We still feel fear of power, but as we had felt it in 90s, yeah, that there could be excesses of power, despotic power, and power needs to be controlled. It's still our condition, but together with it, maybe sometimes, especially, I don't know if it's definitely not the situation in Russia, and I'm not sure if it's the situation in Hungary, but definitely I think even in US, Czech Republic, where there were populist leaders, power, and we all were very grateful for checks and balances and control of power. That is another fear, like fear of powerlessness. Okay, there are some people in positions of power, but they actually cannot do anything relevant. They cannot challenge our fears. So we feel some fear of powerlessness, which becomes even stronger than our fear of power. And in this context, we live in paradox, because we want power to overcome fear, but exactly this fear produces distrust, which prevent us from any future-oriented projects or trust to others, and so we cannot positively reconstruct power, maybe in this fake Heideggerian way, which was presented by Havel, or in other ways. Exactly this fear prevents us, and so we still live in some new reality, but as it was somehow depicted in 18 Primaire of Louis Bonaparte by Karl Marx in introductory lines, we work with old tools. He had that idea that those were only masks, but new social reality will produce good use of this mask. But I am not as optimistic as Karl Marx was, and I think we really, as I'm not so economically determinist, more culturally determinist, I'm afraid that we use those old tools in bad way and not inadequate to our situation. And here I will end. Thank you very much for your.
Now we are moving to Gábor Zoltán Szűcs, Utopia of Fear. So continuing the.
Yeah, and in one important sense, I will discontinue this topic because we already listened to the presentations of two András and Ondrej, but I will be Zoltán. So let's start with the title of my presentation, Utopia of Fear, and I have a confession to make because it was originally intended to be a joke, especially because it's a reference to Judith Clark's liberalism of fear. And as you may or may not know, she explicitly stated that the so-called liberalism of fear is non-utopian. It is captive, it is tolerant, but it is non-utopia. And she was a scholar of utopia in its own terms, and it seemed to me an important thing because my presentation's main topic is the relationship between realism, especially contemporary realist political theory, and utopia, and Sklar is very often cited as one of the predecessors of contemporary realist political thought, especially his name is associated with the liberal strand of contemporary realism, especially because Bernard Williams is very fond of her work, and he made a lot of references to Sklar's liberalism of fear, but also from a much younger generation, Edward Hall started to publish a lot of essays on Judith Sklar, even though the relationship between contemporary realism and Sklar's work was criticized or questioned by some other authors recently. So it means that she's not one of the contemporary realists or the predecessor of contemporary realist political thought, but still there is a connection here. And I thought that in this at least half-joking way, it would be really interesting to explore the relationship between realism and utopianism by making this reference to her work and ask whether it is possible to use a certain understanding of liberalism, the liberalism of fear, to think about politics in non-utopian or non-utopian ways. And of course, this is at least prima facie a hopeless attempt, especially because she was against utopiazing the liberalism of fear. But on the other hand, I think there is space here to disagree with her. So the topic, as I just said to you, is the relationship between realism and utopia. And this relationship is usually presented as some contradiction, two things irreconcilable with each other. For example, in a 2016 article written by Benjamin McKean and published in the American Political Science Review, he discusses Raymond Joyce's and Bernard Williams's works concerning human rights as anti-utopian works, and he argued that they are mistaken because their criticism of the utopianism or alleged utopianism of human rights discourse is very problematic because they actually rely on certain values which they criticize in the name of anti-utopianism. So there is some inbuilt contradiction in their work about that, but still I think it's a very good starting point to think that realism and utopia are in some kind of contradiction with each other. So for the purposes of this presentation, what is utopianism? I'm a political theorist right now. I do a lot of other stuff, but this presentation is a study in political theory. And in political theory, usually people speak about utopianism in terms of the dichotomy between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. And ideal theory, which is an attempt to think about political problems in terms of general principles and showing that we can give justifications for certain political institutions in terms of these principles, or we can point out the unjustifiability of certain political institutions because they do not correspond to these principles. It's very often characterized as utopia, not just by the critics, but sometimes even by their proponents. Famously, John Rawls tried to offer something he called realistic utopia. You can be very suspicious about this conceptualization, but according to him, a realistic utopia is an attempt to reconcile two seemingly irreconcilable ideas. First, to be realistic in the sense that what you propose in your theory will reflect human morality and human psychology. So it will remain within the boundaries of what humans can, at least in theory, achieve in their lives. But on the other hand, it also must be utopian because it should envision something that is beyond the limitations of the already existing institutions. And the big idea is to widen our horizon by thinking about things that not exist yet, but can be actually realized in the future. This kind of defense of utopianism is not a lonely thing or a lonely voice within political theory. More recently, David Estlund, for example, argued against what he calls utopophobia, the idea that political philosophy should not offer utopias. And he says that actually political philosophy should study utopia, should be utopian in the sense that it should not be bothered by the impossibility or unrealizability of certain ideas, because it should not be limitations on our imagination. What really should matter to us is whether something, a good philosophical idea, a good argument, a coherent argument, it should matter much more than its feasibility. And he also says, he actually wrote a long book about this, but he started to publish about this well before his most recent monograph about this topic, that a good political philosophical argument should engage with utopian ideas, and it is very important for them. So let's back to the other side of the dichotomy. We can also have non-ideal theory, and we could take a look at what is around us in the world and ask how we can address the problems we are facing in the real world. And of course, we can think that ideal theories do not address these problems. They speak about something else, something interesting, but not relevant enough. So we should start instead with looking at the world and try to develop theoretical answers to these problems. And in some sense, you can think that non-ideal theory is a non-utopian theory. But is this really how we should understand realism's deep suspicion against utopianism? If our answer is yes, then contemporary realist political theory is just another non-ideal theory. But contemporary realists passionately argue against labeling them as non-ideal theories. They say that their main target is what they call moralism. It's not the problem that we can have these general principles, but the problem is that a lot of normative political theory conceives itself in terms of applied morality, applied ethics. So the big problem is that they violate the boundaries of the realm of morality, and they try to expand certain ideas, the scope or or the domain of certain ideas over the domain of reality, and that's the big problem for them. In my understanding, there are at least two major strands of contemporary realist political theory. One that I call liberal or broadly Williamsian, and there are a lot of examples you may or may not know, that says that this problem appears because there is a certain rationalistic ideal behind modern moral philosophy, and that's the big problem. So the idea to the different elements of our political ethical concerns convert toward some united theoretical knowledge. And this is what we should question, and this is what we should argue against when doing political theory, because the answer to our major political problems, political ethical challenges, cannot be found in these big theories. Why? Not because ideal theory is wrong, but because we don't really need these big theories unifying the different parts of our knowledge. So when they are arguing against moralism, they do not argue against the relevance of moral ideas to politics. They are arguing against what Bernard Williams famously called a peculiar institution, a certain form of doing moral philosophy. And the other form of contemporary realist political theory I call radical, and it has another idea, and you can sum up this idea very easily in the words of Raymond Goyce, who says that what you call ethics is actually that politics. So something that is left there and labeled as an ethical truth or ethical knowledge, but is actually the remainder of some past political conflict, and something that is actually a reflection of power relations. So, is it anti-utopianism a very good, useful concept to describe the main problem of realists? So, realistic utopia is something that is really irreconcilable with the contemporary realist political thought. And I think that obviously this is not the case. And I think that there are at least three different forms of utopian or utopia-like phenomena that are quite relevant to contemporary realist political thought. One is that I call dystopia. Bernard Williams started his political theoretical works with a very Hobbesian thought that the first question of politics is how to secure peace and the conditions of social cooperation. So what we have here is the alternative to political rule, and it is the complete lack of social cooperation, the breakdown of the entire social fabric. That is why we need politics. And it doesn't say that we can actually slip into this state of Hobbesian nature, but it comes up sometimes with examples, very often repeated example of Helots in Sparta, and he says that this is a non-political form of domination, and of course this is something that we cannot accept. The other form of utopia I describe here, as, again referring back to Judith Clark, is a utopia of hope. There is a 2019 article written by Enzo Rossi and published in Constellations, and it distinguishes between three major forms of contemporary realist political thought. One he calls ordo realism, the other calls contextualist realism, and the third calls radical realism. Ordo realism is the Williamsian liberal vision, and it has some kind of obsession with the problem of political order, the fragility of political order, the vulnerability of political order. But what is interesting here is that Rossi argues that radical realists, because realism is not a non-ideal theory, can actually offer ideal theory in the original sense of the term, but realism as ideal theory should still stay away from two hubristic forms of doing political theory. One is what he calls the technocratic moralism, which seeks to offer blueprints for the future, and in that sense, this must remain anti-utopian. And the other form that radical realism, should avoid is ideological moralism. The works of Gerard Cohen or David Aston, who offered a solution to the problems of ideal theory through banishing facts from justification. And he says that realism should somehow factor in the basic facts of politics, and still it would remain offering some kind of ideal theory and can be utopian in the right sense of the word. And the title of his article is actually Being Realistic and Demand the Impossible. And it I think, pretty nicely shows the basic problem here. But I also think that there is a third form of utopia. And this is what I call the utopia of fear, because I really think that even liberal realists cannot really give up their ambition to imagine scenarios that are not existing, may not be realized, they may not even want to realize, but still the entire realist project is based on the idea that politics is about conflict. It is based about discontent. It is based on conflicts between desires, interests, political projects. So it needs some general vision, and I'm not saying that it must be the same vision for each and every person sharing this realist outlook, but you need some kind of vision about a different kind of politics, even if you may remain skeptical about its feasibility. So you might be interested in tolerating competing visions of another kind of politics. But I think that this is actually compatible with the idea of liberalism of fear. And I think that this is something that it serves much better the purposes of the liberalism of fear than what Sklar in time offered as a non-utopian thing. Because I really think that you cannot really just give up on offering something instead of what you have. Because if you do that, then you give up on politics. So that's the conclusion of my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
We made a full circle between the Easter Rising and Judith Sklar. So let the presenters come out, and then we have something like 20 minutes for discussion. So I hope that there will be individual and collective questions as well. Floor is open. If you are thinking, I can maybe start a couple of issues. I mean, like one I wanted to raise to Eglantina. I like the very last sentence you said that it contrasted nationalism and progressive thinking, and I think at the turn of the century this contrast doesn't hold. Simply, I mean, like you have still these kind of nationalist projects which are kind of national democratic or national socialist, not in the national socialist sense, but which are actually trying to negotiate. And then of course at that point it is still very open, and then of course in the 1920s, like De Valera is not a progressive nationalist in any case, obviously, but in the 1910s it's still open, and this is similar to what we discussed yesterday about Yugoslav utopian thinking at the 1910s. This kind of integral nationalism is kind of still having a progressive, social progressive content. So this is one thing. And to András, I wanted to ask you whether actually it's not misleading to use Mannheim for this, because I mean it's such a specific normative distinction between like the transcendent of existence and congruent of existence, but I'm not sure you can use that division as an analytical category to understand what an ideology is beyond this Mannheimian, or what ideology probably you can interpret in a Mannheimian way, but utopia definitely not, because utopia is resemantized by Mannheim for his own purposes, yes, but I mean like utopia means many other things than what Mannheim was actually interpreted, and I think this would have an impact on your whole analysis, because then I think the contradiction between, let's say, utopian and ideological liberalism, for example, doesn't hold. Yes, I mean, like it doesn't relate to reality the way it is related in the Mannheimian construction, because I mean every ideology ultimately is projecting some sort of kind of thing that is not there. But at the same time, every utopia is trying to extrapolate from some sort of kind of social reality that it's actually describing. So I mean, like I don't think the Mannheimian logic would do service to your analysis, actually. And then to Ondrej, I mean, my question, I understand the pathos of what you are saying, but couldn't we turn this argument the other way around as well? That what can we do actually with these previous stages of utopian and, if you want, anti-utopian liberalism now? And if I can pick up on what you made out of Bibot, for example. So I mean, like you read Bibot as a utopian democrat, yes, but at the same time, I mean, actually half of like all his analysis about fear is actually coming from Ferrero, and Ferrero is actually, of course, is a critique of the French revolutionary radicalization. And if you read the context of what Bibot writes, I mean, he's actually writing that it's exactly the French revolutionary, basically religious war is actually destroying the early modern, more linear progress towards kind of from early modern estates liberties to modern political liberties. So actually there is a kind of anti-utopian liberalism in the Bibotian construction. It's not just a utopian liberalism, actually it's a complex balance. In fact, he goes back to Hobbes in this false argument about fear. And if you take that into account, then probably there is one aspect that is important in his thinking, and that is a little bit a question to Zoltán as well, is that isn't there a modality of uchronia in addition to utopia here? Because like exactly what Bibot is doing is actually he's telling that you know, the way somehow to go beyond this cleavage between democratic and anti-democratic, or utopian and anti-utopian democracy, is to actually tell a possible story of how it could have been if there is no clash between, in his case, church and progress. Yes, I mean, like he's telling in his Uchronia text that, you know, had it been that the Catholic Church and the Marxist tradition is somehow finding a compromise, then Marx Pater would have been sitting in the Vatican and would have been writing the papal encyclical Spectrum Pervadit Europam, and then basically in the 20th century there wouldn't have been totalitarianism, but there would have been small pogrom in Germany where 6 Jews were killed. Yes, so I mean, like he basically he creates a kind of alternative story through this exactly alternative history. Yes, so and then I'm kind of thinking whether the potential resource against dystopian democracy is actually uchronic alternative possibilities that we are kind of actually telling as narratives. Yeah, so I mean that, and I think that relates also to a certain extent. So this is my question, but maybe we can collect some other questions and then we can go around the answer group. Colleague?
A question for Eglantina about Pearse's writings. It's a question about sort of unity of the nation and the question of political representation. And I wonder, I think like in the Irish Rebellion, I mean, I'm not a scholar of this, but just reading some of the political texts, it seemed to me that this idea of an integral nation sort of precludes any idea of dividing representation into constituencies. So rather representatives represent the nation as such, like this is how it is in standard Western European and North American parliamentary debates. You sort of are representing the nation, even though you're coming from a different political faction, but you don't have, for example, the right to recall your representatives. You have to wait till the term is over and a new election happens, and the sort of, very particular concerns of a certain constituency aren't necessarily represented as particular, but rather as part of a sort of bigger national frame. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on what representation would mean in this much more sort of revolutionary situation, Connolly versus Pearse, like what the different conceptions are.
Yes, many presentations were concerning or touched upon the issue of liberalism. My question is very simple. In your opinion, this is a question actually to all of you. How to be today non-utopian liberal?
How to be a liberal?
Yeah, of course. It's details the questions were, but I'm curious.
I can take one more. Yeah.
Also, like was a question about Pearse. How precisely is his economic program in regards to land ownership, and how radically does he conceive like redistribution of wealth, especially in terms of land reform? Because it seems to me that like in East Central Europe, especially if you think about the momentum of the 1848 revolution, this issue of abolition of feudalism and the ability of particular national movements like the April laws in Hungary to kind of link the national emancipation story with the emancipation of independence is really crucial in this story. Of course, in the Irish case as well, but I'm not so much familiar about the legal aspect of how the Irish land reform went on. And at the point of the Eastern Revolution, what were the issues in this whole question of the peasantry, and what are how exactly does Pearse, what is his program in sort of linking this land issue with the national issue?
So maybe we can have a round of answers, and then we will have time for another round of questions. The answers are not super long, so we can start with anything.
Not super long. Okay, big questions. I'm trying to give very concise answers, and thank you so much for all your questions. I start with the last one, and then I kind of work my way backward, I think. As regards Pearse and the land question, the British government did try to sort out the land question. It's been an ongoing process. So from the 1830s, 1880s, and there was a very important land act, the Wyndham or Wyndham Land Act of 1803, which kind of returned the land to the tenants. I'm not saying it solved the problem in any way, but it was a step forward. So I'm going to talk specifically about Pearse. The land question is less of a pressing issue than in writings of others from the period. And I tell you why, because he was member of the Gaelic League, and his main point was the bringing or the kind of reforming or the rejuvenation of the Irish language. So that was his major program. So he was less concerned with land or with workers' rights or with the trade unions. Others who were members of the ICA or the volunteers, they would have been more pressed about those issues. That kind of links to, so he would have advocated of the whole land, all of the land of Ireland, belonging to what were tenants at the time. But of course, there's always the problem of Northern Ireland, and the whole issue, whether they are part of the nation or not, and I don't want to kind of go into that. But in relation to kind of link your question to your question back there, I'd just like to say, and I think it links to Ondrej's presentation as well, the other important for him was education. And I think this is where himself and Connolly really differed, because Connolly just was preoccupied with workers' rights, whether Pearse was went along this idea that you mentioned, that we need to educate those people who will be given their rights in whatever democracy or republic we're going to have. And he wrote this wonderful essay called The Murder Machine, in which he called the British education system as the murder machine that kind of cuts into the veins of Irish life. And he advocated Irish language teaching and education of everyone. And he ran a school. And he actually called his, George knows this because I've talked about this at ELTE. His pupils were there, were fighting alongside him at Easter 1916. So he kind of took full classes, which is, a weird and amazing thing at the same time, that they would have such a dedication to their teachers and all of their teachers, because Thomas MacDonagh was there fighting alongside him. So revolutionary representation, I know I'm getting there. If I had found something that was in which he was really precise about revolutionary representation and how to represent the various existing constituencies in Ireland, I would have included that. But he was more of a kind of an idealist theoretician than the actual kind of going into nitty-gritty of representation. I believe at the time there were about 103 or 108 constituencies in Ireland. Some counties had like north, east, south, like North Antrim, South Antrim, and all that. And when the general election was held, I'm kind of diverting from your question now, I understand, but when the general elections were held in 1918, the one that Sinn Féin won, and the one in which they refused to take the seats in Westminster and set up the Dáil, I believe 2/3 of that were, so there was a divide between 2/3 Catholic and 1/3 Protestant constituencies. And of course, there was this whole question about the British government accepting or not accepting the Dáil or the existence of the Dáil. And that led to the Irish War of Independence. So I think when you read Pearse, there is this kind of revolutionary urgency in his writing, but when you kind of look for the nitty-gritties of running a country, that's not really there. And your question, just that's about progressive nationalism. I love that you mentioned it. There are two books that I highly recommend. One is Hepburn and Rumph, who discusses this in detail, and David Vaughan's book as well. I wanted to kind of relate that back to the question of education and how, for Pearse, a reform of education, of the Irish education system, would feed into this progressive nationalist movement that he was leading at the time. And just one last word about De Valera, and I shut up, promise. De Valera is an interesting one because he was a nationalist. I think deep down he was a traditionalist, but he would have described himself as a progressive nationalist. And he gave this wonderful speech on March the 17th in 41, I believe, during the war, in which he set out his utopian vision of Ireland. There's a lot of these utopian visions around this time. And that, again, is a very Pearsian text, which is kind of combining very traditional and kind of progressive thought. So I hope I kind of reflect on some of that.
Yeah, I just mentioned the name of Karl Mannheim quite spontaneously as somebody who represents this dichotomy between ideology and utopia, as he famously introduced this. But my purpose was not to reconstruct his ideas and his thoughts, just to contrast these two things and to overcome these two, to demonstrate that sometimes particularly in situations of rapid social change, forms of knowledge can overlap. So perhaps that was the purpose, and mentioning Mannheim was just, a point of reference, but not a claim to reconstruct his ideas. But I think it's interesting for me. Utopia is something like a perception of a system of happiness and fulfilling life. And ideology is more about mobilizing, giving identity and integrity and so on. And how these color each other, how they should be somehow separated, but still in real life, in East Central Europe at least, there were moments when there was an overlap, or even a conscious proposition by several thinkers in the last 100 years to create an optimal solution for the present. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your questions. The first one really touched me deep down because it was my weak moment, because you asked what to do with those legacies of past, and exactly I spoke as some unreformed titanist utopian who thinks we can jump off our temporality and to invent everything adequate for our time. And of course, this legacy is constituting us and we cannot escape it. And I hope I try to show that I show it. But I think there is that radical utopian titanist temptation, which I performed somehow to work with it. But I think there is some moderate version how to deal with it, and it's to see differences. Yeah, and not to appropriate the past, but see differences. And this is what I tried to do with Bibo. And of course, I don't know Bibo's sources, but I know Bibo to that extent that I know that he is of his time, the critical, skeptical, and somehow non-utopian thinker. But exactly this was the reason why I chose his quotation, that even such a thinker as Bibo defined democracy in a way which, from contemporary point of view, looks like utopian in both meaning of the word, like something what is quite different from what is possible in our contemporary situation. And it maybe leads to question of Uchronia. I think you're right that sometimes Uchronia can look really naive, even more naive than Utopia, and that was the example which you presented. But maybe these Uchronian moments are exactly those moments which can save us for thinking for answer your first question, like for to think about differences of the time. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I think that radical realist versions of utopianism have a temporal and a topical aspect. So the temporal form of this is, methodologically speaking, is genealogy. They think that it's really important to go back in history and to debunk certain concepts, certain values as actually produced by certain historical events or power relations of the past. So in that sense, I think it has a Uchronian aspect as a project, this temporal thing. But there is a forward-looking aspect of this. So sometimes they call it prefigurative politics. So you try to use certain methods on a smaller scale in the present that you would like to see used on a much larger scale in the future. So using certain organizational methods and other stuff in your own everyday practice, even though you think that this should be extended over the entire social fabric in the future, but you don't really know yet how to do that on a larger scale. So these are two temporal things, and in some sense they have some kind of Ukrainian aspect. But on the other hand, I think the topical versions are also very important, and I think that when it comes to the liberal strand of realism, I think the temporal aspect is much less important than for the radical realist version, because they try to somehow to get around the obstacles of the present. So you try to go back in history, you try to go forward and to get around the present. But this is not necessarily the case with a liberal kind of realism, because the big question is how to live with all these kinds of limitations in a way that is not present in our political reality, or is extremely fragile. So you can easily imagine a future where all these conditions are not there, or they are worsened or deteriorated. So that is why I think that this is a more topical kind of vision of politics.
Nobody answered the question of liberal utopia.
I think it's very easy not to be liberal. So, and it's not that easy to be non-utopian. At least this was my big experience with Clark, that it's not that easy to imagine something that does not go beyond what is given. So I think it's very easy to be utopian, not that easy to be liberal. So I'm not sure I have an answer to your question.
Okay, last short question, if there is any, which we can still address to any of the panelists. I mean, like we have would be time for one very smart question. Then the very smart question is where the coffee break. So thanks a lot for